In this level, we're going to be talking about footers and forms. Now we have some great new form elements in HTML5, so we're going to start with those first, and then we'll close out the course with our footer.
With HTML5 and CSS3, you'll be coding up those websites functionally. We all know the secrets, now you can know too. So come on down and join Professor Jason.
So just like with the other levels, we're going to be using our case study site Border and Radius to sort of take us through some practical application of what we're learning. But first, let's go through a couple of key points, both for forms and for footers. Alright, so with forms, first we have intuitive usability. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, many times your form elements are some of the most important elements on your page. They could be contact forms or newsletter signups or a lot of different things. So it's important to keep them intuitive and usable for your user. Second, we have no ugly ducklings. Now, forms can usually be quite technical in nature, but that doesn't mean that they don't need design. A lot of times we can just put our forms together and not really style them. Since they are key elements on our page and a lot of times have key call to action points, it's important that we spend just as much time styling them as some of the other elements on our page. With our footer, first we want to utilize the space. Now, most of our users are going to read our websites from the top down, which means most of the time they're going to end up at the bottom where our footer is. And our footer is a great area to place navigation items or key call to action elements. A lot of things can be put in your footer if you want to draw attention to them. So make sure that you're utilizing the space appropriately. Second, we don't want to forget the style. Just like with our forms, where we can leave out a lot of the styling, with our footer, most of the time it's the last thing that we design, because we usually design from the top down, starting with our header. So we want to make sure that we're putting, once again, just as much emphasis and time into our footer design as the rest of our site. Alright, so let's look at the three main points that we're covering throughout the course: design, markup, and style. Let's head back to our Border and Radius site and take a look at the design strategy behind our form and our footer elements. Let's take a look at our form element first, which is the third block element that includes a newsletter sign-up box. Now, we could leave the styling of the form totally up to the browsers, but why give up control when you can style forms effectively and easily? In this case, the design is fairly simple since it's not really a complex form, but we've used some CSS3 properties such as rounded corners, gradients, and text effects to help the form be more cohesive with the rest of the site. Moving on to the footer, with a site like this we really don't need to include a ton of elements. In this case we've chosen to tie in the history of Border and Radius since this is an important branding element. And we carried the design through with the monotone image like you see in the header, and have also included standard navigation and copyright elements. But as with the form, we've decided to kick things up a notch with CSS3 properties. We'll go through these specifically in just a little bit. Now that we've covered design, let's go ahead and move on to the markup. Now in HTML5, as I mentioned, we have some great new form elements. These include some new input types, native placeholder text, autofocus, and form validation. So before we hit the actual markup, let's go through a couple of these in more detail. Now with our email and URL input types, we can actually define in the markup what type of field that we have. Now this is great for devices such as the iPhone or the iPad, which have different keyboards depending on what sort of form field that you're using. So in this case, we have an email form field, and that's going to generate the keyboard that's specific for emails. So this is a great usability factor because it allows the user to go directly into what they want to do, in this case typing in their email address, as opposed to trying to find all of the characters. Now, our number, date, and color input types currently aren't supported in contemporary browsers all that well, but as they become more supported, you're going to see them in use a lot more. And this is because it's going to give, once again, some great new usability features to our forms. In this case, like you can see in the demo, we can actually bring up different variations of color wheels or color selectors to actually define what we're looking for. And we can also do the same thing for date pickers and number sliders, for example. Finally, we have the search input type, and this thing is pretty slick. In WebKit browsers like Safari and Chrome, the browser actually renders rounded corners automatically. And it also adds a little X button, just like you would see in a native, say, Mac application. And this is great because if you're entering a search and all of a sudden you realize that's not what you want to search for, you can click on that button and it automatically erases your entire search. So once again, this is a much more usable feature and it's going to allow us to do a lot more with our form fields. Now, I mentioned that WebKit browsers automatically add rounded corners. If this is something that you don't necessarily want to have, maybe you want to have a custom design search field, all you need to do is enter this code in your CSS and then you'll be able to style however you want. Alright, so let's go ahead and jump into the markup. And first, let's take a look at what we're actually going to be marking up. In this case, it's our email newsletter box. So previously, we might have constructed our markup to look like this. We have our div ID newsletter, and then we have our various form fields beneath that. So in HTML5, how might we mark this up? Well, we're going to do a couple of things. First, like you would expect, we're going to replace our top-level div with a section because once again, it's a grouping of related content. We're going to add our header tag with a new H1 for email newsletter. And then we're going to do a couple of things with our individual form fields. Let's go ahead and take a look at those in more detail. The first thing that we're going to do, as you can see, is we're going to add our input type email, which is one of those new input types that we talked about a little bit earlier. We're also going to add placeholder text. Now this is pretty cool because previously you'd only be able to have placeholder text that disappeared when you clicked inside the form field through JavaScript or something like that. Now we can do it natively through HTML5. So in this case, we're just going to add this value placeholder and then whatever we would like to exist inside of our form field. In this case, it's an email address. Finally, if we want to make our form fields required, all we have to do is enter required at the end of our string like you see here, and natively in HTML5, our form fields are required fields. Alright, now that we've completed our email newsletter markup, let's go ahead and move on to our footer. Now, we're not going to be doing anything game-changing in our footer markup, but we are going to be adding a couple of new HTML5 elements. So let's take a look at how we might have previously marked up our footer. First, we have our containing element, which in this case is div ID primary foot, and then we have our div ID history section, which includes a little bit of information about border and radius, and has that monotone image like you saw before. So in HTML5, we're only going to make a couple of changes. As you might expect, we're going to change our containing element div into a footer tag, and we're also going to change our history section into an actual HTML5 section because once again, it's a grouping of related content. We're going to add our header, our history in this case, and that wraps up the HTML5 for that particular markup. Next, we have our footer navigation and a little bit of copyright information below that. So here's how we might have marked that up previously. So in HTML5, just a couple of quick little changes here. Instead of having a div ID info, we're just going to change that to section. And instead of having div ID footer nav, we can go ahead and change that to our nav tag because it is navigation. Alright, so now that we've got our markup complete, let's go ahead and work on the style for our email newsletter box and our footer elements. Alright, first let's take a look at our markup once again just to give us a reminder of what we're working with. So if you remember, we have our section ID newsletter and then our actual form fields. So let's get our basic styles out of the way first, like you see here. Next, we're going to be focusing on styling the specific fields within the email newsletter signup. So as you can see here, we're just going to add our standard border radius property with our vendor prefixes ahead of our standard property. And we're going to add a radius value of 5 pixels. Now, as you can see by these images, we have a before and after. So before, we have our just standard rectangles, and then after, we have our rounded corners. Next, we're going to work on our submit button. Now our submit button is pretty cool because prior to CSS3 we would only be able to create this using an image. For our submit button we're going to render everything in CSS3. Let's go ahead and take a look at how we might do that. First we're going to get our basic styles out of the way like you see here. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to add text shadow and we're also going to round the corners. So in this case you can see our text shadow is once again our letterpress effect. And we're going to add a border radius of 8 pixels. Next, we're going to add a CSS gradient to our button. Now, if you can remember when we covered CSS gradients back in level 2, they can be a little bit tricky. So for this button, I've once again used John Alsop's CSS gradient creator, and it's given me the code like you see here. So in this case, we're going to create a gradient from kind of a darker gray to a little bit of a lighter gray. And let's go ahead and take a look at that button rendered completely in CSS3 in our browser. Alright, so the last thing that we're going to do for our button is add a hover state. Now with CSS, and in particular CSS3, we have a number of different options that we can use for hover states. You've seen a couple of those in this course already. In this case, we're going to keep it pretty simple and just add a standard box shadow so that when you hover over the button, it just lifts it off the page a little bit. So our code would look something like this. An X value of 1 pixel, a Y value of 1 pixel, and then we're going to give a 3 pixel blur. Now the only thing to mention here is that we've added an opacity value of 0.4. So we've kept the color as standard black and then dropped the opacity to 0.4 as opposed to trying to find a gray color that works. This is a quick and easy fix to adding some drop shadow to your elements. Alright, so now that we have that done, the last thing we need to do is go ahead and style our footer. Now our footer includes some pretty basic styles, so I've included them in the reference slides for this course, but I'm not going to go through those in depth right now because they're pretty much just standard CSS styles. What I want to do is go ahead and jump ahead to the actual CSS3 properties that we're going to add for a couple of elements in our footer. So let's go ahead and take a look at the copyright section of the footer. Alright, so the specific element that we're going to target with CSS3 properties is going to be the bottle image next to our copyright information. So what we want to do here is we want to add a CSS transition on hover. So the way that we're going to do this is we're going to set our basic styles first, like you see here, and then we're going to add our CSS transition property. Vendor prefix is first, of course, and in this case we're going to transition the opacity of the image with an ease in out function like we typically use. And then on the hover state we're going to add an opacity value of 0.5. Now if you notice on our static state we have an opacity value of 0.15. So in this case we're going to be going from a more opaque image in the static state to a less opaque image in the hover state. So ready to take a look at how all this fits together in the browser? Alright, let's head on over to Border and Radius and check it out. Let's first take a look at our newsletter sign up form. Here's a look at what this would look like if we didn't use some of our new CSS3 properties. Once again, it's usable, but it's a bit boring and bland. By adding CSS3 properties, we get a form that looks like this. Rounded corners, native placeholder text, and a button with gradients and rounded corners all in CSS3. And if we move on to our footer, most of our content is pretty straightforward. You can see that we have a text shadow with our history copy, which is a nice element, and you can see how we rendered our footer background to be opaque so the texture bleeds through the color. And here you can see the transition that we added to our bottle image. So congratulations, we've built the Border and Radius homepage in semantic HTML5 markup and with some kicking CSS3 properties. Hopefully this has been a helpful, functional example of how to use these great new features. But wait, there's more! Since you've made it this far, we wanted to throw in a little something special. So we'd like to invite you to have a drink on us. Now what do we mean by that? Well, let's go back to our Border and Radius site and I'll show you. So let's check out our bottle image again. I think you'll find that a few things have changed. Yep, that's a spinning bottle, and if you look real close, you can actually see the liquid inside of the bottle being drained. So I assume you're taking us up on our offer of a drink. Pretty cool, huh? The power of CSS3. It really is amazing some of the stuff that we can do. Now if you're interested in taking a look at the code that we used to create this, we've included it at the end of the slides for this level. Enjoy and cheers. Alright, so that concludes the last level of the course. Congratulations for making it this far, but you're not quite done yet. Let's go ahead and apply what we've learned in this level and jump into the code.